NABU and SAPO have uncovered an organized criminal group consisting of current members of the Ukrainian parliament. Who are these people? What did they do? Where are these MPs now? Are they in the country? Or perhaps they've long since gone abroad? Why is this an investigation? Strangely enough, and by the way, not for the first time, it coincides with important peace talks between Zelensky and Trump. And what does Timur Mindic have to do with this? I'll tell you in just a moment, friends. But first, please subscribe to this YouTube channel and don't forget to like and leave your comments. This is very important for the growth of our community. And so as not to waste any more time, let's get started right away. And it all started with a dry but, such an explosively informative statement from NABU and SAPO. Law enforcement officers reported the results of a long undercover operation. The anti-corruption officials announced that they had uncovered an organized criminal group that included current members of parliament. And so, according to the investigation, members of this group systematically received unlawful benefits. Simply put, bribes. They received bribes for their votes in parliament. Then, friends, events started to unfold literally like in a detective story. But this is a characteristic trait, a particular feature that really is inherent to our anti-corruption agencies. It turned out that during investigative actions, while trying to enter the government quarter in order to get directly into the parliamentary committees themselves, the officers of the State Security Department, UDO is the security service, the State Security Department. So apparently the UDO resisted the NABU detectives. UDO explained this by saying that they were simply checking the people whom NABU had brought along as witnesses. After the check, everyone was released, but the situation itself, that supposedly investigators are being obstructed by other law enforcement officers, actually doesn't seem like any kind of sensation, friends. This really happens quite often here, so for us it's nothing new, but it's yet another telling moment. At the same time, information from journalists appears. Supposedly, detectives were allowed into the parliamentary committees, and they are also conducting searches at the Parkovy Business Center. That's where the headquarters of the Servant of the People Party is located. Officially, the party denied that the searches were taking place in their office specifically, but the information remained up in the air. That's when the first specific names started to appear. Ukrainian MP Yaroslav Zhelezniak suggested that the suspicions might concern a small group of deputies from the Transport Committee. It's interesting where Mr. Yaroslav got such information from. But the publication Zerkalo Tizhnia later, actually even earlier, wrote that the next NABU cases would concern the Servant of the People MP Yuri Kaisel. Moreover, it turned out that NABU had been monitoring him for a long time, conducting investigative actions, and even dismantled covert listening devices that had been operating for a full 2 years, according to this publication. And here again, the question arises, how do the journalists from Zerkalo Tizhnia know the details of the investigation in advance? But we'll come back to this later, actually. And to the deputies who know a lot, and to the journalists who also know a lot, at this time, friends, Member of Parliament Rostislav Pavlenko makes a specific statement. Searches are being conducted at Kisyl's and Yuri Karyavchenkov's places, the very same Yuzik from Kvartal 95. It's a case about envelopes and illicit enrichment. NABU quickly refutes the information about searches at Karyavchenkov's, Yuzik's, but remains silent regarding Kisyl. And Kisyl himself somehow disappears from the radar and is not getting in touch. By the evening of the same day, the picture becomes clearer because once again journalists come to the rescue. The journalists from Zerkalo Tizhnia and Ukrainska Pravda mention specific names. And according to these media outlets, at least 3 members of parliament have received suspicions. Zerkalo Tizhnia writes about Yevhen Pivovarov, Ihor Nehulevsky, and Yuri Kisyl from Servant of the People. And in particular, the publication Ukrainska Pravda also adds Savchenko to the list. Allegedly, they were served suspicions under Article 368 of the Criminal Code, receiving unlawful benefit. But the court ruling also mentions Article 255, which is about an organized criminal group, and Article 369, which concerns giving a bribe. In other words, the investigation sees this not just as isolated cases of bribery, so to speak, but as a structured criminal organization. However, Yuri Karyavchenkov, known as Yuzik, was not served a suspicion notice. But according to journalists, he did not, so to speak, wait for possible developments and allegedly left the country. Moreover, I came across information that he was not supposed to be served this suspicion notice at all, but that's another matter. In addition, the head of the Secretariat of the Servant of the People faction, Taras Melnichuk, was also questioned, and this actually suggests that the investigation may affect the party apparatus itself. We'll see. Separately, friends, it's worth focusing here on the figure of Yuri Kisyl. Why is he mentioned so often? First, the connections. According to investigations, it was in his office, according to Zerkalo that the servant deputies allegedly, emphasis on allegedly, because we don't know this for sure, received those very envelopes. They wiretapped for 2 years and recorded contacts with Serhiy Shefir. He previously worked in the president's office, which he allegedly visited personally after that. Second, it's about voting, because he is among those who voted for the bill that made NABU and SAPO dependent on the prosecutor general. In other words, he tried to weaken those agencies that are now serving him with suspicions, but there were many such deputies. In fact, and all this paints a picture of a deputy who is right at the center of influential connections and potential conflicts of interest. But despite all this, friends, there are still a lot of questions. And the first of these is a strange coincidence. Why is it that every time Ukraine stands on the threshold of peace negotiations, NABU and SAPO become so active? Last time it was the case. Midas, and this time literally during Zelensky's visit to Florida to meet with Donald Trump, a new case with envelopes in parliament. Not after the meeting, but exactly the day before it. Undoubtedly, anti-corruption bodies should not be guided by any political arrangements, calendars, and so on. But then why do they give such an impression? They constantly seem to be guided by them. Well, have you ever wondered why this NABU and SAPO operation was carried out right now, friends? What do you think? Can such exposures improve our position at the peace negotiations? This isn't the first time this has happened. I'm all for these corrupt officials ending up in prison. They should be justly punished. I don't want you to think that I'm defending corruption in any way. Corrupt officials should damn well be in prison, period. But I'm surprised how such coincidences are even possible. Well, this definitely doesn't earn us any points at those very negotiations, let's be honest. The United States of America, as the recent story with Midas showed, will definitely use this against us at the negotiating table, and they are using it. Well, for example, it could have been done, say, 2 days later after the meeting. And aren't you surprised by how certain media outlets, which I mentioned here today, and certain members of parliament, whom I also spoke about today, have so much information about the secret investigation? How do they get it? That's the question. Who is leaking it to them? And you know what the main question is that arises? Why? Why do we hear information from specific media outlets and members of parliament instead of the press service of the National Anti-Corruption Bureau? Why are they the chosen ones? Somehow? I don't know. I think the answer here is absolutely clear. Nothing is done just like that. But even that, we could somehow just turn a blind eye to if there was at least some result. We're basically living in some kind of political TV series, sorry. All we hear are announcements, loud headlines, raids, suspicions, which, by the way, it's still unclear whether they've even been officially delivered because NABU hasn't told us about it. Only Zerkalo wrote that someone, and Ukrainska Pravda that someone was served with suspicions. But we don't know anything from NABU. They're staying silent. They just write details to follow and remain silent. Meanwhile, friends, all the people involved aren't in jail. They're abroad. Well, not all of them, but definitely many. Why is that? Who is letting them leave the country? Who is allowing them to slip away? Why aren't NABU and SAPO monitoring this, even though they probably could? Overall, there are a lot of questions about the effectiveness of their work. Just remember that same Mindic, for example. By the way, I want to say that during reports about the searches, during the first of these reports, many people actually got the impression that this was a continuation of the case. Midas, but no. These are two separate stories, parallel cases that are unfolding almost simultaneously. Well, let's say they're progressing at nearly the same time, and they create this effect, of a two-front anti-corruption offensive. But let's keep it brief. Let me remind you, the Midas case, or Mindic Gate, is an investigation uncovered by NABU. Incredible corruption within the Energoatom scheme. Businessmen, including Timur Mindic, allegedly collected kickbacks from suppliers, with sums reaching hundreds of millions of dollars. The case led to a political crisis and the resignation of ministers. However, the main figures, Mindic and his partner Alexander Zuckerman, fled Ukraine. And just recently, investigative journalist, undoubtedly a talented one, from Ukrainska Pravda, Mikhailo Tkach, found Mindic and Zuckerman in Israel and spoke with them. Both of them have Israeli citizenship, I should remind you, and this complicates extradition. And so what did Mindic say? Mindic says that he became the victim of a major media attack, that he was made the scapegoat in the media. He refused to comment on the legal aspects of the Midas case. As for his acquaintance with high-ranking officials like Umerov with Halushchenko, the former Minister of Energy, he did not deny knowing them, but he denied exerting any pressure on them or giving them any instructions. They caught me too. That's a whole separate genre. He also claims that he plans to return to Ukraine, but he did not comment on the case, just showed up there for an hour. For $250,000, he stated that NABU detectives, together with someone else, made a movie, I quote, referring to all these published tapes and recordings, and that this was done not just for nothing, but in order to destabilize the situation in the country. That was the reaction from both Mindic and Zuckerman. So let's sum up, friends, what this whole story means. NABU and SAPO publicly announced the exposure of an organized criminal group, which may or may not include members of parliament, and possibly they have been served with notices of suspicion. Why possibly? Because we don't know for sure yet. The case is still far from over, since the announcement of suspicions is only the beginning. If there are any at all, there are questions about preventive measures, and new names may emerge, especially among those who gave bribes. All this is still ahead, maybe or maybe not, because there were announcements about members of parliament as well. So if we believe the narcotics police, they fled abroad. And why announce it? Is it so that they can escape, or how does this all work? Who can explain this to me? This whole working scheme is a bit unclear, to be honest. The main challenge actually is the result, which I have already mentioned. Will all these suspects, reasonably suspected individuals, end up behind bars? Will the guilty actually receive real punishment? Or will everything just be swept under the rug, as often happens, and we'll keep living in this soap opera? When will there be geopolitical consequences for us? When will we once again be catching fish, sport fishing, showing it off, and then releasing it back just for show? And one more question. Both NABU and SAPO have been working here for quite a while, as you know, friends. Corruption in parliament is not some kind of news. And money in envelopes is nothing new either. It was the same during the previous convocation when NABU and SAPO were created. You're probably not surprised by the selectivity, for example, after so many years since NABU and SAPO were established. The more time passes, the more questions arise about this whole story. Because from the previous convocation, you could catch so many potential figures who received and gave money, and from this one too, by the way. But for some reason, they come at specific moments and to specific people. Think about it, friends. So thank you for watching the broadcast until the end. Write what you think about this in the chat under this video. Take care of yourselves and see you next time.